Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dagmar Divjak. I work in the School of Languages and Cultures. I'm a linguist, so I look at how languages are structured and how they express meaning, but I'm also a language teacher. And over the past year, I've been working on a project that tries to combine insights from linguistics and psychology into language learning to make it easier for people to acquire a foreign language. And one of the things that I've been particularly interested in is language and memory. So one of the important facts that we found evidence for in language is that language is very sensitive to frequency effects. And frequency is something that in general predicts human behavior very well. As it says, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And that is true for a whole range of things, from riding a bike, putting your clothes on, to speaking your mother tongue. Because however strange it may sound, speaking your own language is also some kind of a behavior, and it's subject to the rules of frequency. You'll remember this, especially those of you with children here, you'll remember that the first word your child says was something it heard very often. It's usually mommy, daddy, taddy, in my case, cookie, which says a lot about my parenting skills, I guess. But you also recognize it, for example, when you read and you misread something. You may be reading a word that really says blur, but because it's an unusual word and you don't expect it, you may read it as blue. Or, for example, when you're in the pub speaking to friends, you understand what they're saying, although it's very noisy, but you're more likely to understand very common words than a very strange words that they would be throwing into their conversation with you. So what you do often, you do easier, you do faster, and you get better at it. The good thing is that we extract and use this frequency information automatically. We don't need to do anything for it. We don't need to remind ourselves to count how often something occurs. We don't need to pay special attention to the words we're trying to track. This is something that happens automatically. It's a very powerful mechanism. It's so powerful, actually, that linguists have used this insight to develop theories that explain how language is acquired that rely mainly on frequency of occurrence. And it's also something that we can use to make second language learning easier. But before we can do that, we need to look very briefly into how our memories work. Memory is sensitive to frequency because memory is sensitive to how elements are presented over time. And there are two things there's something that your memory likes and something that your memory doesn't like. Your brains don't like to be presented with lots of information that it needs to store and recall in a very short period of time. But your brains are really very good, and there are evolutionary reasons for this, for dealing with information that presents itself regularly over time. Of course, if something happens regularly, it's going to be important for your life. And in that case, it makes sense for you to remember it, right? It increases your chances of survival. One more thing I need to tell you before we can look into tips of how to use what we know about memory to improve your language learning is that we very often think of brains as computers, and that's a metaphor that has also been prevailed in psychology for many decades. But our brains don't work like computers. It's not, you don't put one piece of information into one spot. So the yellow spots aren't words that have to do with football, and the red spots aren't words that have to do with hobbies, for example. Our memories are stored all across the brain in so-called networks. And these networks need strengthening for you to remember something. You can compare it in a way to preparing to run a marathon. The more you train for it, the more you will build the muscle and the stamina to do so. It's the same when you try to remember something, including another language. So if we use this information about what we know about memory to make it easier for people to learn another language, we get a few hacks, so to speak. So you will have experienced, I guess, that cramming before a test may get you a good grade the next day, but a week later, it will feel like you never ever looked at that material at all. And that is because cramming, taking in information in a short period of time makes that information accessible for a short period of time, but there really is no long-term learning. In order to achieve long-term retention and learning, you need to make use of the spacing effect, so you need to do things regularly. It is a little bit like the doctor and the apple, except that in this case, it's like a little a day keeps forgetting a day. So if you want to make sure that you remember those 10 words that you're supposed to be studying, it's better to study them for a couple of minutes every day than to spend half an hour the evening before the test. in order for your brain to remember something, thank you, you also have to be active, because memorizing requires active processing. And many students seem to think that activity is physical activity, so they will write the words 100 times. But it's very rarely the case that by writing a word 100 times you will actually remember it. In fact, you will most likely not remember it. So what you need to do with the information is process it actively, which usually means a good way to do that is to organize information. So instead of staring at your Spanish emotion words, you could organize them in a way that forms a story. And even better is make it meaningful. Think about your relatives that are impolite or happy or kind or embarrassed or afraid, and make a story about them in Spanish and try to narrate that story for yourself. Another thing that is very helpful when you're trying to create memories and remembering words is the same as creating memories, is that you make use of contextual cues. So not trying to memorize the word in isolation, but try to memorize the word in its correct form in a meaningful sentence. That's going to give you more than trying to memorize words as a list. And one of the reasons why this is helpful is that contextual cues help with retrieval. So you may have experienced, those of you who know a foreign language, that sometimes you really can't come up with a word, and what helps very well is to try and imagine yourself in a situation where you used that word before. So if you have used that word in a number of contexts, so if you have put yourself while you were studying in a number of contexts in which you could use that word, then when you have to retrieve it, you have much more cues to help you remember that word. For example, if you are trying to memorize words for football in German, it's actually not a bad idea to watch a football game in German, rather than trying to look at, and spending the evening looking at your word list and trying to remember that. Another important thing is for you to test yourself, because recognizing something is a very different thing than being able to produce it. So if you can recognize all of the words on your word list and are able to translate them, that's one thing, but that's not the whole thing. You also have to be able to retrieve them. And in order to be able to do that, you need to practice retrieval as well. And then another last important thing is that you monitor your progress. So if you are trying, again, back to the word list, trying to memorize 10 or 50 or 100 words in a foreign language, once you've gone through them a few times, you will know quite a few of them. Put those cards aside and focus on those that you don't know. Then put those cards back into the pile and go over all of them again. So monitor your progress. You don't have to repeat those things that you already know. You have to pay more attention to those things that you don't yet know. So 5 top tips from language teachers that also have a basis in what we know about memory is: don't cram, spread your learning and sleep on it. Be active. Active doesn't mean be physically active, but mentally active. Organize the information in a way that it makes sense to you. Use the context both to encode words, because that means you'll have loads of cues for retrieval as well. Create cues that will help you remember, so make your word list into a story that is meaningful for you, and test yourself and monitor your progress, and you'll find it a lot easier to start on that word list.